Yes, I think my mic is on. A very warm welcome to the Balie tonight. My name is Juri Albrecht. I'm the director of the Balie, and I will try to conduct this conversation tonight. Something happened that reminds me of the fact that please put your phones on sort of quiet. You can, of course, use it for Twitter or whatever you like, but not put the sound off, please. Wonderful that you're here, and the viewers at home, of course, as well. A warm welcome. What we talk about when we talk about anti-Semitism. Are we going to speak tonight about difficult topic, I would say, difficult topic for the past few, always maybe, but especially for the past few years, 2 years maybe. So I really appreciate the fact that you're all here, and especially that you two are here, because you're going to discuss a difficult topic not in your mother tongue. And so we do appreciate the fact that we will have patience with each other, and because words matter and words need to be chosen precisely. And that's also the topic of tonight, one of the topics of tonight. A word and a book by Mark Mazower, and I'm really very happy and honored that you're here. Warm welcome to you in the first place. We're going to have this conversation between historians because this book just came out. It first came out in Dutch, and which is a wonderful thing because it helps us, our language to survive and our publishers to survive. So it's wonderful that it first comes out in Dutch. It's going to come out in English, of course, as well. We are going to talk about the book. I'm going to first conduct a conversation with Mark Mazower and then ask you two to come in, and later on everybody in the room to come in, as we always do. And I just remind you now, but we have ample time for questions. But a question is a Dutch sentence, or an English sentence in this case, which sort of goes slightly up to the end and has a question mark. And I'm sure everybody knows that. But yes, few words carry such heavy connotations and are at the same time so prone to misunderstanding, I would say, as the word anti-Semitism. Much confusion of the definition of this word, especially since October 7, 2023, but before that, a few hundred years of misunderstanding, maybe at least. That leads to confusion in discussion about Israel-Palestine conflict, about Gaza, Jews, Judaism, all those sort of things, Zionism. But it's important because we cannot talk to each other with too much, if there's too much ambiguity about the words that we use. And in time of shouting accusations back and forth, it's of crucial importance, I would like to say, to keep talking to each other. Also about difficult topics and about misunderstandings. There's no need to provide clarity. So there's need to provide clarity. So that's what we're trying to do a little bit tonight. I have to say, it's a wonderful book. Do read it. And one of the good things about it, so I'm saying we're trying to give some clarity, but one of the good things about it is, in my opinion, that it doesn't give straight answers and clarity. It just confuses you on a higher level, probably. And the best thing is that it really invokes you to think yourself, to start an inner dialogue with yourself about many of the topics. And I think that's a wonderful aspect of a good book, and especially of an academic book of a personal kind. So I can truly recommend that to you. Mark Mazower, I don't think he needs too much introduction, but he's professor of history at Columbia University in New York, taught at Princeton, studied in Oxford, specialized among many other topics in modern Greece, 20th century history, and the history of international institutions as well. Wrote many books, too many to mention, but among others, A Dark Continent, a wonderful book, Europe's 20th Century, I think, a gripping book. Hitler's Empire, Nazi Rule in Occupied Europe, and now, of course, about or over anti-Semitism. It's still called Over Antisemitism, but there's a Dutch version. I'm going to introduce you two a little bit later when we come on, so we have a short break maybe in the intellectual conversation. Professor Mazower, if I might start out, it's a great pleasure of having you here, and we are going to talk about the book, but now that we have you here, can I just start with one other topic? I came across your Financial Times essay published just a little bit earlier, and we're taking advantage of you being here as has been working and living in the United States. This is an essay: "For Europe, America was the future. Now what?" How worried should we Europeans be about America? Are things ever going to be mended again there? Or
well, it's a good thing we're starting with the easy questions.
Yeah.
And I like the idea of being in the business of providing higher level confusion where we were just existing in lower level confusion before. I was trying in that article to knit together a few things that have interested me in my historical work over a long period of time about the interrelationship between the United States and Europe, or an idea of Europe that Europeans have, which I think arose, the idea of Europe in Europeans' minds and the idea of the United States as a kind of vision of the future were two things that arose at a very similar point in history, which is to say the early 19th century, and they have remained mutually constitutive more or less until this day. That it's not that everybody in Europe always thinks about the United States as the future. That would be a ridiculous kind of thing to say. But I think it's habitual to think about the future often in relationship to the United States. And for many people in Europe, there was a long tradition of looking across the Atlantic to see what a mass democracy might look like, to see what mass consumerism would look like. And conversely, there was a tradition in the United States to look to Europe as a model of institutions, or maybe a model of institutions to avoid. So there's this kind of sense in which Europe and the United States were bound up with each other. And now you have what feels like some kind of rupture. Of course, we don't know how deep a rupture it will be because we don't know what will happen tomorrow. But there is an administration that appears to have a degree of almost visceral hostility towards the idea of Europe that is rather new. And so the article was just trying to think through what the implications of that will be. It's very hard to be in a relationship when the other partner hates you. Although, as we know, that doesn't prevent such relationships from existing, sometimes for quite long periods of time. So I was trying to take the emotional temperature of this particular relationship.
And you end with a very nice sentence, and I interpret it as optimistic, but I'm going to ask whether you think it's optimistic. Europeans now have to figure out the future they want for themselves, because first they were looking at America for a lot of those things. Is that sounds rather optimistic, isn't it? It's a good thing.
I think it's a necessary thing. Mm-hmm. I think it's a necessary thing, actually, which is not to say that means a repudiation of all the things that tie Europe to other parts of the world, including the United States. But I think the US is changing in many ways that would make it a good idea for Europeans collectively to think together about what they want in the world. Yeah.
Yeah. Your colleague, Timothy Snyder, who's been our guest before, but writes sometimes on topics like you do, a historian, you probably know him, but he decided to leave the United States, and said that one of the lessons he learned from history was that the earlier you leave a fascist regime, the better. How do you look upon that? Because you're teaching at Columbia University.
Well, it's quite interesting being at Columbia these days. And if you're a historian, there's something to be said for that. I don't know the circumstances of my colleague's departure. Actually, from what I've read, this was already in the works some time earlier, so I would hesitate to say that I know why he left or anybody left. But as I tell my students sometimes, and you can imagine students, especially students at Columbia, are now wondering what world they live in. But if you're a historian and you're close to the action, there's much to be said for that. You learn many things that you could only read about indirectly in some other way.
That's a nice bridge, I would say, too. Because maybe first, this is not a book which would fit in, well, in some ways, yes, but a different book than books you wrote earlier. It's more personal in many ways. So what made you decide to write another book on anti-Semitism? Because in the end, you have, of course, a very nice for further reading, and there's been ample writing on anti-Semitism, of course. So what made you decide to?
Well, it wasn't a subject that in itself had much preoccupied me intellectually before, although it was part of subjects that had interested me because I work on 20th century European history, and so inevitably you have to think about that. But I tended to come at this from the position of a Europeanist. And I guess I had also been trained myself by, in ancient history, by people who taught me that it was always desirable to think about something other than yourself, and that intellectually it was always desirable to try to work on something that was in some sense alien to you, which was true of ancient Greece, but then true of the subject that I focused on, and which was modern Greece. The attraction was it wasn't really much to do with me, and I've never regretted that. The genesis of this was very different. It arose, I think, for two reasons. One was that I was teaching in circumstances over the last few years when everybody was talking about anti-Semitism, but they were talking about it in ways that I simply didn't make sense to me. And there seemed to be, and maybe this is the one thing that everybody can agree on, a great deal of confusion about the way this term was being deployed. And the second thing was something that, to be honest, I feel slightly ashamed about, which is this was not a topic that was easy really to talk about if you were not Jewish. Or rather, if you were not Jewish, you could talk about it, but there were constraints as to what you could easily say without laying yourself open to all kinds of criticism. And that seems to me an intrinsically undesirable state of affairs for any subject, that the discourse on the subject, and this is not peculiar to anti-Semitism, one can think of other subjects where there is a similar sense. But so when all of this happened, I guess, I did feel in some mild way some kind of obligation to shove my foot in and give my view on what was going on. So that was the origin of it, really.
Out of personal responsibility in many ways. Because
intellectual responsibility, I think, in some sense. Yes.
And that also because you are of Jewish descent.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that makes it, what makes it more, well, easier maybe, and would put you on the spot to do that?
I always admired, there was a guy called Francis Carsten who I knew, who was the first person to teach modern German history in the UK. And he'd come in 1938 as a refugee. He'd been in the Young Socialist League. I befriended him when he was very old. And when he was much retired, he was in his early 80s, I brought him down to a class at Sussex to talk to the students. And they were fascinated. And he was describing how at the age of 12, you got enlisted in the Young Falcons, and their eyes were growing bigger at this idea of this radical politicization in Berlin in the late 20s and the early 30s. And after all of this, I said to him, "But Francis, you haven't once mentioned the fact that you're Jewish." And he said in his very thick German accent, "It is of no importance." And I always rather admired this view. So one would like to have this conversation, that is to say, the larger public discourse about this in that kind of vein, that we have to be able to find a way of talking about this subject, which is in a way emancipated from identity politics and constraints of this kind. And in general, I feel that quite strongly, I think, in my own teaching. People should be absolutely free to say what they want. That said, of course, as a historian, the first thing I always ask myself when I read a work of history is who was the historian, where did they come from? So these two things exist in a strange kind of intellectual balance, I think.
Understand. Yeah. But then to the sort of your definition of it, how would you define anti-Semitism?
Well, one of the things this got me interested in was definitions. Mm-hmm. What are definitions? What do they do? Mm-hmm. When might you want a definition? And actually, when might you not want a definition? And of course, the experts in definitions are the dictionary writers, and the dictionary writers differ a good deal on how to think about definition. And if you go to my idea of a good dictionary, like the Oxford English Dictionary, what you will find under a particular word often is a series of definitions, because a dictionary developed on the historical principle will understand that the meanings vary across time. And so if the question is reposed as how have the meanings of anti-Semitism changed across time, I guess to sum that up, I would refer to a map that is in the middle of the book, which tracks the Jewish population of the world by continent. This map arose because I was perusing the website of the American Jewish Committee one day, and it had on its main web page a map of the world that showed all the continents where the AJC was active. And there were 5 main continents, and there were 5 circles, each of equal size. And you know, being of a contrary kind of mind, I thought that's really odd, because they shouldn't all be of an equal size, because the Jewish populations of these different continents are wildly different in size from one another. I wonder what such a map would look like. And so I realized actually I could encapsulate this question, the answer to this question, in 2 maps. The first map would show you the world in 1920. If you looked at the world in 1920, there's one enormous circle, which is the Jewish population of Europe. At that time, it was about 80% of the world Jewish population. And then you would have a somewhat smaller circle, and that was North America. That was predominantly the migration from Russia and Eastern Europe that started earlier. And then there would be a rather smaller circle, that was the Middle East, with a small circle inside, which was the Jewish population of mandatory Palestine. Then you look at the map of 100 years later, our own times, and of course the European circle has shrunk, and it's no longer the largest one. And now you have what are currently 2 larger circles of roughly equal size, and one is North America and the other is Israel. And so why does this matter? This matters because I think that one way to think about the confusion is a shift from one world to another world, and a shift that's actually happened in the lifetime of somebody who's 80 or 90 could have themselves lived through this shift. They could have been born into a world where we knew what anti-Semitism was. It was the predicament of a minority in Europe faced with political movements that were determined to persecute them, to discriminate against them, in the ultimate case, to exterminate them. That world is not the world we live in now, because we are the other side of that world. We live with the memory of that world, but the memory of that world means the memory of that meaning of anti-Semitism survives. But now we're in this other world where the 2 poles of Jewish existence, if I can put it in that way, are the United States, or North America in general, and Israel. And those are 2 societies in which anti-Semitism has acquired somewhat different meanings over the last 50 years, and in particular meanings very closely connected with Israel. And so now we have a second set of meanings of anti-Semitism that are connected with what you can say and what you can't say about Israel, which was not something, for obvious reasons, that worried anybody in the 1920s or the 1930s. And so these 2 discourses, the discourse of, to be simple or simplistic about it, the discourse of Jews as minority in nation states, and the discourse around Jews where there is a majoritarian Jewish nation state, but a lot of controversy around it. These two discourses push against one another, and there's a lot of the confusion is the result of that.
Yeah, that's the shift in the definition you describe.
Let's call it usage. The shift in the usage. I mean, definition raises the question of who defines and how authoritative the definition is. Let's just say the usage of these terms, the context for the use of these terms are radically different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It says about anti-Semitism, the history of a word.
Yes.
And that's the usage, you would say. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
And the first usage stems from the 19th century.
Right.
And you say it's halfway through the 19th century. There's a moment,
1879, 1880.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that shifted in use. Although if you look at your map, we have it here, and I'm probably not going to be able to see it, but you described it wonderfully. But then there are, of course, at least half, or even more than half, of the Jewish world population living as minorities, and the other half is living in a nation state where they are the majority ethnic group. So, would you say that they're still in use both, so that the shift is sort of in parts of the world didn't happen and other parts it did happen? Is that?
Yes, you have a situation today in which Jews are a minority in other countries, and so they're very sensitive to the question of persecution, discrimination, violence as a minority. And then in Israel, the Jews are in the majority. And now you have a different set of questions, which is actually around the relationship with the neighbors, around the fate of the Palestinians, all of these kinds of questions, question of land and territory. And anti-Semitism is invoked. But I think there's another dimension to this that it might be worth mentioning, and I guess Emil and I might have a conversation about this down the road, which is the question of what, if anything, really changes in the middle of the 19th century. What's the significance of the emergence of a word? When you might say that it's perfectly obvious that anti-Jewish prejudice of various kinds, stereotypes, have been around for much, much, much longer than that. And that's a very important argument amongst historians, I think, and quite a lot hangs on the position that you take. So it's not an irrelevant argument, but I think that the point I wanted to make was about the difference between prejudice and political movement. To be very crude about it, you can only have a political movement, which anti-Semitism is named for, in an age of politics. And you only have politics in the modern sense of public opinion, parties, in the 19th century. Very, very late in the day in writing this book, I started to realize that all I was doing was following in the footsteps of some great 19th and 20th century lexicographers who had no great interest in anti-Semitism at all, but they had a very serious interest in words. And there's a phenomenon that they talk about, which is the emergence of the anti-word. I suddenly thought, yes, of course, amongst other things, we talk about the Semitism in anti-Semitism, but what about the anti? What is an anti-word? And then you discover a very interesting thing, which is anti-words unknown by and large in the 15th, 16th century. The earliest anti-word is antichrist, that's the first. And then there's this explosion of anti-words around volatile social and political contentious issues in the middle of the 19th century. And you can trace the origins of many of these words. America was particularly prone to this because mass politics had come very early to America. One of them, not an American invention, was anti-Semitism. And so you could see from this point of view something changing in this mid-19th, late 19th century moment. And what's changing is politics, and the politics of reaction in this case, and reaction to what? Reaction to Jewish emancipation. So the kind of argument that I propose, which is posed in strong terms and therefore lends itself to counter-argument, is to say everything changes in Jewish history with emancipation, and everything changes in European history with the coming of mass politics and democracy. And anti-Semitism is this political counterforce that emerges then and I would say, has a rise and a fall as a political movement. It still exists today as a prejudice. It existed in Roman times as a prejudice. But as a political movement, this is tracing the arc of that, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And let's get into it after clearing one more thing out, and let's get into as partly this as well, of course. You're also describing in the book that by now the usage of the words has changed and has become, and you used the word a word weapon. It has become a word weapon in the discussions we're having on Israel, on war, on Jewishness. But what do you mean with that?
Well, I guess we're all around this table teachers in various ways. And so we're used to the situation in which we're teaching in class, but increasingly in the outside discourse, people are being made to feel either you must use this word or you must not use this word. Right. You must describe this as apartheid or you must not describe this as apartheid. You must describe this as genocide or not as genocide, and so on. In other words, the words become the test of whose side you are on in an antagonism. That's what I mean by using a word as a kind of weapon. And that's problematic for the historian, because the historian wants to be able to say, I actually want to use the same word in a different way. And I actually want to be able to discuss the extent to which what's going on in the Middle East is usefully described or not by apartheid. Why shouldn't I? I don't, and so on. So one of the things that occurred to me was that this is a feature of this discussion, is that it's grown out of, and it has led further to, words being patrolled. And what I think makes me most anxious is what the effect of all of this is having, not only on our public conversation, but actually on the capacity to teach. You want students to be able to say stupid things. It's a sine qua non of teaching. You want them to make mistakes. You want them, hopefully accidentally, to be offensive if it happens, and you want to explain to them, because that's how you discover. And so I feel that we are moving further and further away from this capacity to teach these difficult subjects. And this, if we make a start here, this is a big part of where the problem arises. And that was, of course, my own personal experience, was to see how this was playing out.
Mm-hmm. Now we also see students that correct the teacher.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It's not only the other way around,
yes.
but about the words that you use.
Exactly.
Words being patrolled. Huh?
Right.
And so, as teachers, all three of you are, all four of us are historians, but all three of you are teachers. But it's not only that, of course, it's much bigger than that. Because you start your book and you end your book with Victor Klemperer, citations of Victor Klemperer. I don't know whether everybody knows Victor Klemperer here, but a German scientist who wrote a wonderful little booklet just after Lingua Tertii Imperii on the words that Nazis used and the abbreviations they used, and how this sort of is an ominous sign for what they were going to do by simplifying language. And so it's not only about teaching, of course, it's words being patrolled, then we're not able to communicate at all. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, if I give you the most obvious, the most central, the most impassioned example of this right now, what is the relationship, to be crude about it, between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? Okay, there's a huge range of views about this, all very sincerely held. So you have to be able to have that discussion. You have to be able to figure this stuff out, and we're very far from that, because we're now in a situation where actually, in some places, what you're allowed to say in these matters is going to lead you liable to disciplinary action or to worse if you're a student. And politicians are starting to get involved. In my opinion, generally a bad idea in sensitive matters of this kind. And to tell people what words mean, abstracted from context. And so it seems more and more important to me for academics to reclaim the capacity to help the society in this moment figure this kind of thing out. I don't think it's actually insuperable, but it's made more difficult right now because of this intolerance around speech.
This is, I think, the point I'd like to introduce you to a little bit longer and get you into the conversation. I'd like to introduce Nadia Bourras, Associate Professor and Researcher at the Institute of History at Leiden University. Very warm welcome to you. And she's affiliated also with the Netherlands Institute in Morocco, the NIMAR, wonderful institute in Morocco, doing wonderful work for historians and many other sciences. Academic topics. The center of expertise it is in Morocco, of the Leiden University. And Nadia Bourras regularly appears as an expert in the media on current affairs, also in the field of integration and migration. Thank you very much for being here. And Emiel Schrijver, General Director of the Jewish Cultural Quarter here in the city of Amsterdam. And there are several musea under it. Professor Schrijver is also a professor by special appointment of Jewish book history at the University of Amsterdam. And in January of this year, he and Ruth Peters published the book Eyewitnesses of Antisemitism, ooggetuigen van het antisemitisme. A collection, an anthology, I would say, a collection of eyewitness accounts of antisemitism through the centuries, many centuries, like we just said. Jew hatred, and we're going to talk about anti-Semitism or not, but Jew hatred exists for many centuries. It's an amazing book. I knew a lot of the text, but then this collection doesn't make you very...
Don't read it before you go to sleep, is what my co-author used to put on the title page.
But it's also the text it put together, and there's a part of Mein Kampf in it as well, which I think is very logical that's in it there. But did you have any qualms of publishing part of Mein Kampf in it?
I was also on the editorial board of the edition of Mein Kampf, so I would not have been very, let's say, very honest if I would not include it in here, because there was this German big, what they call the scholarly edition of Mein Kampf, that was republished in the Netherlands, whatever it was, and that was republished in the Netherlands with a lot of fewer notes. I mean, and I was involved in the publication of that with the same publisher, by the way. So
it should be in here, I think. But
yeah, well, Mein Kampf is not unimportant in the history of anti-Semitism.
No.
The understatement of the century. Yeah.
If I can ask first the same question to both of you, just a short opinion on the book, and you can choose which where you want to start. Nadia,
sure.
Can I start with you? Some remarks on the book, and then to Emiel, and then we continue.
Wonderfully written, of course. It's a great account of history of a word, and what I found very interesting about the book is that it also speaks about the political meaning of anti-Semitism, but also about memory, and that is interesting. And it's at the same time it's a warning that we shouldn't exaggerate the use of anti-Semitism, but at the same time not minimize the dangers and the fears that comes with the rise of anti-Semitism, unfortunately now. So for me, that was one of the central themes that I liked, how language shapes our understanding of history, historical memory in a way, and political realities. And I must say that I was very much convinced by the whole book, and it really resonated with also what we see in the Netherlands in our public and political discourse. I'm sure you're not that familiar with our political discourse, but there are many, many similarities in the way you describe, well, the American public and also political discourse, and how anti-Semitism is weaponized by many stakeholders.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, yeah, well, I was looking at your...
Thank you.
You're ready? Yeah. Yeah, I was looking at your table of contents, and you have you have two sections, part 1 and part 2. But actually, I think you've written two books and one essay. Because the approach in the
all in one
book.
Okay.
So the approach to the topic in part 1 and 2 is totally different. I mean, part 1 is I would say narrative of the development of the what you would probably call the politicization of a term. Then the second part is really about the instrumentalization of the history of anti-Semitism by the State of Israel, which for me actually is proof of the fact that we stopped in 1945. That it was the best decision ever made.
Yeah, that's right.
That makes
I was not going to ask you because it's not about.
That was the best. And actually, it was one of the elements of criticism on the book was that we did not continue there. It's a totally different topic that needs a totally different approach. And this is a source book, primarily. And your book is an analysis of a development of the coming into being of a term within the political debate. The second book is about the instrumentalization of the term by the State of Israel. So at any time between 1945 and 1948, and the way in which the presence of the State of Israel, the support or lack of support of the State of Israel, the fact which we make very clear actually, the extent to which the now considered, or until recently considered, 100% supportive attitude of the U.S. towards Israel was not so much. That was certainly not the case in the 1950s. So that is something that is often forgotten, and I think you make that very clear, and you may also make very clear that development. The third one is really an essay. My third one is actually the third part of the book, so to speak, is actually an essay on today's world. So you have a totally different approach, and this is actually where the analysis is stronger, when the analysis is more polemical, and where your position becomes way more polemical. So I see a development in your book from descriptive towards descriptive interpretative towards polemical, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I'm just curious why you wouldn't have thought a third, why you haven't thought of a third section. The second comment that I would like to make is a compliment, which of course I should have started. I've learned an unbelievable lot of work, and I'm especially impressed with the scope of your source material. So I knew a little bit about the topic before reading it, and the extent to which you detail the complexity of the situation, especially in Eastern Europe, for me was really very, very impressive. I'm not sure that we agree on let's say, the polemical part on every aspect, which we shouldn't. It is part of what you discussed, but I applaud your book, and I've read it with great pleasure.
Thank you.
I saw you taking notes. Are you already wanting to say something back? Or
if you would like to say something, please do. Otherwise, I can.
No, please.
Okay. Well, thank you both very, very much. It's wonderful to be here with you both, and I'm very honoured that you would take time to come. So if I start with Nadia, yes, I think you're absolutely right. It's about historical memory, but actually it's specifically about how individual words can carry memory. And Victor Klemperer was somebody who had a great influence on me in this, but somebody else was a Victorian, the Archbishop of Ireland in the days when there was a Church of England Archbishop of Ireland, was a man called Richard Chevenix's Trench, and he wrote a Victorian bestseller that for some reason my parents had in the bathroom, and I used to read it. It was called On the Study of Words. Absolutely brilliant. And he was one of the progenitors of the Oxford English Dictionary and the pioneers of the idea that, in a way, what you're saying, that words carry historical memories, actually sometimes multiple historical memories once you start to explore them. And so that, I think, was exactly what I was trying to do. And the weaponization, yes, one feels the tension. There is, there's one even more polemical would have been to say this was all a study of weaponization. And that would be much too strong, because it isn't just a study of weaponization. And in fact, weaponization as a process, not that I've thought much about it in general, probably only works in conjunction with other factors. So, in other words, weaponization implies bad faith. Weaponization implies people know there really isn't anti-Semitism, but we're going to say that there is. And what we're talking about, especially in the last decade, is far more complex than that. I think I felt the complexity, especially when thinking about shift in American Jewish identity, And a culture of anxiety emerges in the US, actually at precisely the time when the indicators of anti-Semitic discrimination are dropping precipitously, which is puzzling Jewish social scientists. So clearly there's anxiety, however you describe it. So that's a real problem for the historian, but the weaponization is very important. As to Emil's point, yes, I see exactly what you mean. Look, I once wrote a book about 20th century Europe, and it was shortly after the end of the Cold War. And the reason for writing that book was that the historians had not yet established a narrative of the post-45 period. And actually, pretty much all the source material for the second half of the book was taken from social scientists. And so there was an intellectual project, which is let's start thinking about these two things together, which haven't been thought together. And because they hadn't been thought together, they read to me differently. And the same thing could be said of this. We are very familiar, historians of 20th century Europe, with a story that culminates in the final solution of the Jewish question. I think that's what you meant by descriptive. In fact, we're familiar, but many areas remain highly contentious and debated among historians, and I tried to probe at some of those in this book. It was always tempting, for instance, a book like this, on the chapter on the Holocaust, to write a history of the Holocaust. But actually what I had to do with something somewhat different, which was to write a history of anti-Semitism in the Holocaust. And that sounds, you might think that's the same thing, and yet it isn't the same thing. So that had a set of well-trodden paths and debates. The post-45, especially the post-48, the material both on changes in culture in Israel, culture in the Middle East, in the Arab world, transformations of the US Jewish situation. There was much less of a historiographical consensus. And so you're forging your way, and it has a different kind of feel to it. And then the end and the beginning of the book, which were where, in a sense, emotionally the book started, grew out of my own, and really written in the first person as what I saw over the last 2 years that led to the questions that led to the book. So the book ends in a way at the starting place. And the great difficulty all the time was there was too much emotion in it. And I was constantly trying to take out the adjectives, the emotional adjectives, because they don't last, actually. But you're right, that reflected the genesis of the project, really.
I'm tempted to go into the whole weaponization Israel debate, but I'd like to first take a little bit step back to what you were referring to. It's interesting, the word that it has this anti before it, but how about, isn't it sort of anti-Semitism ages older? And I wonder what you two think about it. I looked it up again. Yeah, I took one of my older booklets, Die Juden als Minderheit in der Geschichte, looked it up, and then I found Fez, sort of pogroms, which were not called pogroms, but I found Fez 1033, Granada 1066, I found the Rhineland 1096, and that was Mainz and Frankfurt, and which were pogroms in the sense we know them from the 19th century, from the Belarus and Ukraine, and so I'm a bit I wonder how you would look upon that. You know, it's all very well that starts halfway through the 19th century, but this is a much older phenomenon, isn't it?
Maybe because I wrote a book on 2000 years.
And the good thing is that you are historians who know about those things. I was wondering what you thought about that.
I mean, sorry. I mean, this is really on top of my interest in the topic. you're very strict to the goal of the book, which is a study of the term. And the study of the term has its full relevance in today's discussion. So a study of the term emerged in, let's say, the 1870s. I mean, Steinschneider was 1860, and then it was 1879 when the Antisemitism was founded.
Actually, it's a word from anti-Semit, made by anti-Semites.
It was the first time that it was used as also as a substantive.
As a political program.
As a noun, noun. And so that's one thing. But the other approach, and this is the approach that you didn't choose, and which I think is the reason why it's perfectly fine to make the choices that you made. That is the experience. I was asked to do a book on eyewitnesses, and what is an eyewitness? I mean, what is an historical eyewitness? Who knows? Who knows how reliable these accounts are? But it concentrates on the Jewish experience. And the Jewish experience of hatred, and the Jewish experience of power systems, not so much political systems, but power systems, which put them in the position of a minority, which led to these expressions of anti-Jewish feelings, let's put it very, very neutrally, and to horrible expressions of anti-Jewish feelings. That is a lot older, and it's not irrelevant to our interpretation of even of today. I mean, I have one example, which is Martin Luther. Luther has
the founder of Lutheranism.
Yeah, the founder of Luther. Well, but also one of the fathers of today's Protestantism, which, especially in Holland, but also in the U.S., is extremely dominant in the, let's say, the almost criticism-less pro-Israel movement. And Luther was, if we talk about instrumentalization, Luther was instrumentalized by the Nazis. There's an example of text of Luther on the Jews who was actually reprinted. They were oftentimes reprinted in the Nazi period as a justification,
of course,
for the Nazi, and it's relevant now. So the
arch is longer, you would say.
And you described it very well, the shift from right to left in the modern day period. So I think that the history of Jew hatred is very much relevant long before the introduction of the term. And I agree with you that political systems, that anti-Semitism, is only possible in a system in which is defined by politics. But power is also very important, and I miss the element of power, and I miss the element of the human experience.
For me, it was completely logical why the book started in the 19th century. Because then we see that anti-Semitism becomes a political ideology. And for the first time in history, I would say, you're more knowledgeable, of course, your book predates the Holocaust era and World War II. But I think that was the first time that Jews were racialized. And of course, there is a very long tradition of anti-Jewish hatred in many contexts. My specialty is North Africa. I will talk about that in a little bit. But I think that Jews being racialized now for the first time makes sense because, or doesn't make sense, but it's understandable.
It doesn't make sense, but it makes sense to use the word from that point on.
You would, because the term was coined in the late 19th century, 18th century. 19th century, excuse me, where we see the emergence of nation states and other social phenomena, industrialization, nationalism. Before that, in the very long age of anti-Jewish hatred, Jews could actually escape persecution by converting, for example. So it was really theological anti-Jewish hatred. It was motivated by theological, religious reasons. It was periodical. It was local, mostly initiated, not always state-sanctioned, because then we talk about pogroms. And then, so we see the racializations where, even though Jewish did convert to Christianity, for example, or even Islam, back then they would be safe. In the 19th century, it became a political ideology where Jewish populations, Jewish communities were considered distinct. They were racialized as the inferior other. So they were discriminated against.
The word othering. Yeah.
Sorry?
I was going to use the word othering as well.
Othering, whatever you want to call it. So even if they wanted to, free themselves from persecution and convert, for example, that was not an option because it was considered that Judaism was innate, distinct from Western civilization, and they were considered the inferior other. So for me, it really made sense starting in just to give you an example from the Moroccan context. We've seen, you mentioned a couple of the tensions between the Muslim population. The Jewish populations are indigenous to Morocco, right? But what we see is that in the 12th century, and then again in the 18th century, we see that from time to time, religious rulers would persecute Jews, especially to gain more religious authority or to make sure that they are legitimate religious leader. They would quite often attack non-Muslim religious minorities, in this case, the Jewish population. And then when we see really anti-Semitism, so state-sanctioned anti-Semitism, where Jewish people are racialized as other in the Moroccan context, then we are already in modern times. In the 19th century again, where, sorry to say that, Professor Mazower, but the British played a very problematic role in many problems that we see today in the Middle East, but also in North Africa, where they instigated, the system of protégé for protection, where also Jews were taken out of the control of the authority of the Sultan and considered to be westernized or Europeanized, and no longer were considered, subjects of the Moroccan monarch. And then with colonial times, we see the implementation of anti-Semitic laws. And that is when the Nazis occupied occupiers, if you will, in 1940 until 1942. So there is understandably a shift in anti-Judaism, which is also deeply rooted in Islamic tradition, of course, as well as in European tradition. And then we see the emergence of anti-Semitism as a political ideology where Jewish populations are racialized as the inferior other. So for me, it made sense, although it taps into that very rich history of anti-Jewish stereotypes in the Netherlands, but in other parts of Europe.
Sorry, I want to hear Professor Mazower as well, but one of the...
it's a conversation, so
yeah, well,
but
one of the examples that I often give is the overall presence of anti-Jewish prejudice, even in places in Europe where Jews didn't live. So that makes it. There's if you look at sermons, for example, from Scandinavia, we have a Swedish sermon in there, but there are many others. Hundreds and hundreds of examples of sermons, and sermons are very, very interesting. And these sermons were often held in situations in which there were no Jews at all. There's anti-Semitic imagery in churches of the Judensau, for example, of the Jewish. The version of the pig, where Jews would have a sexual relationship with pigs, a very beautiful, very nice.
That's the anti-Semitic trope. Yeah.
So the old anti-Semitic trope is there, and these anti-Semitic tropes exist without the Jews being a threat to society in everyday life. One can identify that as only theological, but it's more than that. I mean, there is.
In which way?
There's no use from the point you don't defend your own faith by making a connection to contemporary Jews. You can discuss the position of the New Testament or whatever. You can discuss the position of Christianity in an historical sense, but the connection of an historical discussion of a contemporary discussion in the 14th century, in the 15th century, on your religion, on an event in your religion, and the connection with your imagined Jew of today is something that is really problematic, and that is bigger than just a theological discussion. That is hatred towards a people, even if the people are not a problem in your situation.
No, sure. Yeah.
And so it's there is a fine line there. There's a fine line. It's not only theology.
I agree. Yeah.
It's not only theology. But I'm curious to hear the boss.
If only. There are basically two fairly starkly opposed positions that historians take. And there's a school, or several schools perhaps, of historians who would say you really have to start the story way back in time, with the beginning of a literature of hatred and prejudice towards Jews. That certainly starts in early Christian times, if we don't even want to go further back than that, and that covers the ages that are covered in Emil's book. And nobody would really deny that. That would be silly. There is a tradition, and it's a particularly relevant tradition in Europe because Europe is Christianized. And Christianity has a particularly complicated relationship with Judaism that, you know, one might kindly call ambivalent from a theological point of view, because it is complicated, because Christianity, in fact, not only grows out of Judaism, but retains the original Jewish book as its Old Testament, which it didn't need to do. So there is an ambivalent relationship between Christianity and Judaism, and a long, long history of antipathy, stereotypes, and so on. And indeed, in the world at large, virtually every society that we can think of before about 1960 was a society in which ethnic groups had stereotypes about one another for one reason or another, and often loathed one another. That was, in fact, the historical condition. And it's only in very recent times that I think we've come to be surprised by that, but partly because of the histories that we've lived through, and we see what that can lead to. But there is this long, long history. The second school of historians would say, actually, yes, there is this long history, but something fundamental changes if you're talking about anti-Semitism. Particularly, let's be clear about this, if you want us to understand the Holocaust, something fundamental changes in the middle, late 19th century, and let's just call that politics. And let's make a distinction between anti-Semitism as a politics and anti-Semitism as prejudice or anti-Jewish prejudice. And the politics has a relatively, I mean, the politics has its own antecedents in intellectual history and so on, for sure. But something starts in the 19th century and explodes and culminates in the middle of the 20th century in the events that we all know. Why does this matter? Why is this more than just an argument among historians? Because I think your conception of what you're talking about, what you're dealing with, affects what you think you can do about it. If you are thinking about anti-Semitism within the realm of politics, whether it's the anti-Semitism of the early 20th century, or it's the connection with the events in the Middle East and Israel and Palestine today, a political concept has a political argument attached to it and potentially political solution. You're in the realm of politics. But if your view is fundamentally the politics are secondary, that when people articulate these things that you take to be anti-Semitic, what they're really expressing is a deep and largely irrational emotion that they've expressed for hundreds or thousands of years, then it's much less clear to me that you are in a position to articulate a political response to that. All you can do is defend yourself against it. And so I don't take this position because I think it makes for good politics. I take it because I think it's true. But you can see this playing out right now. And to take us into the present day, if you think that enmity towards Israel is essentially the product of hatred of Jews, then what you're left with to do is to defend yourself forever against hatred. But if you think that there is a politics to this, that it is, let us say, for the sake of argument, an argument about land and ownership and borders and boundaries, then there is the space for a political strategy or political strategies. And so I think actually very large things end up being at stake in how you conceptualize something that's, after all, an amalgam of all of these things. It's going to affect what you think is possible for the future.
To what extent is the notion that I introduced before, which is that both historical anti-Semitism and the let's say the anti-Semitism in this politicized manner, as you define it, are also about the exertion of power?
I think that's super important because actually, as we know, There is a very interesting argument going on at present amongst Jewish historians about power and Jewish history. And so power seems to me a super important word. We could say, if we wanted to generalize, that the long centuries of Jewish life before were a series of stories of Jewish powerlessness, right? We could also say that one of the tropes of the protocols of the Elders of Zion and classic conspiracy theory was the theme of Jewish power, that Jews are all powerful, which makes it difficult to embark on the possibility that we're in a new situation, and in certain circumstances, indeed, Jews do have certain kinds of power that they didn't have in the past, which seems to me the case. And actually, if you look at the emergence of very successful Jewish community in America, that's a kind of power. There are other ethnic groups that have comparable power, or maybe not comparable, but they have similar wielded power. There is a power that has to be acknowledged and thought through what its influence is. Israel has a power. It's a state. It has an army, rather effective one. So we're in a new realm, and I totally agree. I think power becomes an absolutely fundamental way of thinking about this shift from powerlessness to some form of power. Yeah.
Emil?
I mean, there's no way not to agree, because I mean, this is a lot of what you're saying. Actually, the way, especially the way that you phrase it, is too obvious and too logical to counter. What I probably would see as a risk, and which would be my criticism of the, let's say, the third approach that I see in your book, which is of course it's also there in other parts of the book. But the third approach of the book is that it perhaps trivializes the experience. So
which experience?
The experience, the antisemitic experience, the Jewish antisemitic experience. So the Jewish experience of antisemitic hatred, of anti-Jewish hatred today, but maybe even in the past. I mean, but especially today. I am totally capable of discussing Israeli politics and all, and I do it in the public realm as well. I mean, but that's not the issue. But making it into a political discussion has the risk in it. It carries a big risk in it of trivialization of the actual expressions of anti-Semitism that have become dominant. And I'm not saying that you're neglecting it. I'm just saying that it's that this mode of discussing it is so academic, which is a compliment, but that the academic way of discussing it has the risk in it that someone who is being hit on his head. You told me a story before about your Persian guest last week who was attacked on the street because other guys, because the guy thought he was a Jew.
Yeah. Last week, one of our
one of your guests
attacked in the street because they thought he was Jewish. Yeah.
They thought he was Jewish.
Actually Iranian, but
yeah, he was Iranian, and they thought he was Jewish. Who was attacked on the street.
You can be Jewish and Iranian.
Yeah, you can.
That would be what. That would actually that's one of the most interesting communities, the Iranian Jewish community. But that's sad. Yes, I agree with you. It's political, but it's also, and I think one of the reasons why it's become so difficult to have this discussion is the emotional nature. Not of the, it's the words. I agree. It's and word weapons. I agree, but it's also personal experience and the fear. And this is true of every discussion that we have of inequality. It's and of racism and of discrimination. I mean, it's the fear that defines the way in which people talk about it, and it's the fear, and some of that fear is very, very justified.
And it's real, yeah.
And the
experience is real and is
the risk that I see, and I'm making a strong statement in order for you to be able to respond to it, but the risk that I see in a strictly academic approach and the political analysis. That is the risk of trivialization of the actual experience of hatred as a victim.
Do you want? Because I hear you.
Sure. Yeah. No.
And then we go back to.
Of course, that is
Mark,
what complicates, of course, talking about anti-Semitism, because you can talk about it
and other forms
and
of hatred.
of course you can talk about it from a very intellectual perspective or academic perspective, and then that shifts the attention away from lived experiences from Jewish communities. That is true. At the same time, it can be very difficult when we discuss, political issues that it centers feelings and emotions. So I don't want to be dismissive. That's why I was very nervous to participate in this whole conversation, because I don't want to be dismissive. Well. Yeah. I don't want to be dismissive of anyone's feelings, of course, and take that into consideration when discussing anti-Semitism or whatever happens in Gaza, because it is multi-layered, of course. And you don't want to, but I don't think we should, because of feelings and emotions and anger, because there are many emotions, we should shy away from discussing many topics, be it in an academic environment or just in the public arena, or because that fear exists among other communities as well, of course. We have, in the political discourse, which is very dominant. By the way, we have a dysfunctional government which fell just a couple of days ago, but it's a far-right government.
It was already dysfunctional before it fell.
It was, that's true. It's far-right dysfunctional without any mandate at the moment. But of course, we also see how the instrumentalization where you talked about earlier of fear within Jewish communities is used to scapegoat other communities. And I think that is very problematic. So, of course, when we discuss these topics, we need to bring everything together, and that makes it complicated. That's why I think the way we discuss this topic or any other topic that concerns Gaza and Israeli politics in an academic sphere, as you mentioned before, we're teachers, we're academics. So, and I feel that because of the argument of security and fear, that it really censures voices, critical voices, and it sanctions critical voices. And I think that this discussion, especially in academia, you're from a university, of course we've seen the footage, we've heard the stories. The same happens in Dutch campuses where the administrations are interfering in how we talk about these very delicate and sensitive topics, where I think it's a responsibility of the academic community. I think the university administration should deal with safety by making sure that whenever there is a fire, you can escape by stairs or there is a door that can open. They shouldn't interfere in issues of social safety within the campus. I think that's the responsibility of the faculty and the student body. And we are very capable as an academic community to discuss these matters without having university administration. I'm not talking about rioting and all of that. I'm just talking about having teach-ins, having organized discussions about what is happening in Gaza and Palestine. As you mentioned, students can be very obnoxious, they can be very insensitive, they can be even ignorant on many topics, but they're allowed to do so. They're allowed to do so in a very safe environment. And of course, it's important that we take into consideration the safety of all students, Palestinian students, but of course also Jewish students. What kind of teacher would I be if I'm negligent about the safety of my students, my Jewish students?
And how would that tie in with anti-Semitism, to be precise? Because I do understand, of course, that it's very difficult to discuss these topics in academics, but
yeah,
what?
Well, because solidarity with Palestinians, or even the j'accuse against our government that fails to uphold international law is considered to be an act of anti-Semitism.
Right. So, yeah.
And this is not a fringe opinion. This is an opinion that is articulated by leading politicians.
So we're back
in
to
this
the
country.
policing fact that if
there is a lot of policing, yes. And I think it matters if you ask the question, what are you afraid of? And the answer is quite surprising in most cases. I mean, intimidation, attacks, absolutely abhorrent, should not be in place in any sphere. But most of the time, it's also discomfort or fear, rational, irrational fear, anger. But it doesn't help if we have politicians and leading publicists who declare any type of solidarity with Palestinians
As anti-Semitic.
as anti-Semitism. Because it
but
minimizes
that's
the actual
we all agree on that.
anti-Semitism that exists. We all agree on that, of course, hopefully.
Yeah, we do.
Professor Mazower.
So, thank you both, and I'll try to be brief because it'd be very interesting to hear from the audience. In response to Emil's very thoughtful comments, I think it's precisely because actually I take the reality of lived anti-Semitism very seriously, and I think if I wasn't worried about it, I wouldn't be so bothered about the inflationary use of the term, to be crude. It's because I think there's remaining a serious problem that I think we have a duty to try to establish what it is and what it isn't. And as Nadia said, if you're a teacher, you have in your classroom, you don't necessarily choose, and you have people from all walks of life and all kinds of views on this and other issues, and that was certainly been my experience in my university. You're curious about them all, and you're sympathetic to them all in the sense that you have to make them all feel part. So you're very sensitive to people's emotional reactions to things. I think that what you saw, if you read some of the university task force reports on anti-Semitism, was, however, something problematic in my view, which was a tendency to collate large numbers of reports from students who had felt that they were the victims of anti-Semitism and to report them. And I think any policeman would tell you that that's the beginning of an investigation, but that's not the end of an investigation. It's the end of the investigation if your investigation is to ascertain the state of their feelings, the state of their comfort level, how they feel about being there. But it's not the end of the investigation if what you're trying to establish is what exactly were they subjected to and how serious is the problem of anti-Semitism. Then their feeling that they were subjected to anti-Semitism is an element in an inquiry that has to go on. And I'm afraid that too often, even colleagues that I respect who were involved in very, very, very difficult, heated environment, found themselves simply relaying the experiences of students. And so that's not particularly atypical because it comes out of many years and this complicates the study of anti-Semitism like anything else. It comes out of many years in which one's sense of prejudice took a kind of subjectivist turn. You felt you were the victim of an offense, you in fact were the victim of the offense, or close to that. There was a presupposition that you were. Well, this has played its part here too, because many of these students genuinely felt that they had suffered from anti-Semitism. And yet, if I look at detailed descriptions of the incidents they refer to, I'm not sure that they fit. They fit my definition of obnoxious behavior, even distressing, frightening behavior sometimes. But in my way of thinking, to ascribe them to anti-Semitism, you have to be able to articulate the motives behind the assault or the attack or the aggression. And those are often very opaque, sometimes very difficult to understand. And so there's been a lot of generalization of this on the basis of people's experience. And I don't think we're going to get very far because we're just going to repeat the confusion around the term that we're living through. I mean, these students genuinely feel, and sometimes they were right. I wouldn't say that they were wrong on every occasion. And sometimes I would say that they were wrong. And sometimes it was being instrumentalized. So you're in this very complex terrain, but here comes this word that can be wielded with and here's maybe the problem of it, there's no comeback. If you use this word in the wrong way, there's no penalty. It's very easy. And so that also lends the situation to abuse, and the situations of real violence, real aggression, real suffering get swept together with everything else. And it's very, very hard to keep the word in such a way that it will do service for us and we will take it seriously. And what worries me, that if this continues, it will be harder and harder to take it seriously in the environments that are often experienced on a daily level by European Jews in their countries. There's no dispute about that. We find it hard to retain its power in those circumstances.
Well, I've written numerous times that for me, if we look at the situation at universities, I'm convinced that 98%, 99% of the student protesters are not anti-Semitic. The problem that I have, and I think it's a part of a word that I've introduced last week in an op-ed that I wrote on the way that we have our public debate, is that the what I call the hyperpolarization of our debate, the idea that we don't just have the polarized debate, but we have a hyperpolarized debate in which the middle ground is almost gone. And it's becoming dangerous. I mean, if you talk about to actually walk the middle ground, in such a situation, the 1%, 2%, whatever percent, I don't care about percentage, but the small percentage of clear anti-Semitism that is part of that movement is not being contested by the movement. And there is my problem.
By the movement
so I have a bunch of protesters, and I'm thinking of an example that makes my point. But throw all the Zayos in the canal. Throw all the Zayos in the canal. That was sung recently on Dam Square. Throw all the Zionists in the canal. Mm-hmm. We can argue whether that's anti-Semitic or not. At least it's very unpleasant, and the intention is not very positive. I just try to understate. But we live in an age in which we no longer are willing, and I think this is a good example that is actually possible, and the fact that our audience hasn't interrupted that is also a good example that is possible.
We get to the audience.
Yeah, I know, but we live in a time in which it becomes more and more difficult, not so much to listen to each other, but to accept that we don't have the same opinion on the same problem. And that is,
but
I think,
you're saying also something else. You're saying it's no, of course, no problem that you demonstrate for Gaza, but it's a problem that whole demonstration doesn't object to this smaller part. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. And I remember...
And that leads to sort of radicalization, you're saying?
15 years ago, I was in a football match in Arsenal Stadium, and I was among, as an Amsterdam Ajax Jew, I was in the middle of PSV supporters. And there was within this group of hardcore PSV supporters, there was a group that started to shout against black players in Arsenal. And they were actually corrected. Racist chants. So they were actually corrected. Mm. It's the only time that I've seen this in my life.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Can I say something
Please?
about that?
Yes, yeah.
There isn't a movement where you can talk to leaders and ask them to correct their followings. But I totally get that, get your point. What I find more, this inter-individual interactions, I find that that can be very tense and polarizing, as you said. But what concerns me most is how institutionalized anti-Semitism is weaponized against other groups. So there are new anti-Semites. The new anti-Semites today are the 3 M's: migrants, Muslims, and Moroccans. And I think that is very problematic because it shifts the attention away from real anti-Semitism and also this recognition of the idea that we are not anti-Semitic anymore. This is what happened during World War II is a historical error, and what predates the Second World War, of course, that's a tradition, but we're fine now. The new anti-Semites are the newcomers, the ultimate other. Mm-hmm. And again, this is not a fringe opinion.
And they are not Le Pen, and they're not the extreme right, they're not Orban, they're the newcomers. Hmm?
Yeah, but this mm-hmm. Exactly. And this has a very wide political support in this country. And I find that because it's not only racist rhetoric, because let's be honest, it's implemented in policies and laws. You can sanction and discipline those who commit these anti-Semitic acts, which are not anti-Semitic acts, because everything now is considered to be anti-Semitic. So for me, and it also breaks down the community that exists on the ground. And I think that our politicians who do this, it has a function as well. You mentioned in your book the historical guilt and taking the attention away from the guilt and always be in support of Israel. But I think today it also has a function. And the function is that we can create this moral panic, and then we can say, the Jewish communities are very afraid and fearful. They're afraid to go out on the streets and wear this and wear that. And the perpetrators are, Moroccan's Muslim immigrants, right? And for me, this rule and divide has a function.
A political function.
It has a political function, yeah.
The reason why I chose to discuss exactly this point in the framework of the way in which we debate in public, because it's a lot bigger problem. I mean, look at what happened. We had Trump. We had our right-wing government. We had the situation in November 8th with the sure. Maccabi Tel Aviv, which exploded this thing. Regardless of it's a different discussion, but regardless of the interpretation of what happened there, the whole thing became way more complicated. But the same is true of the way the women are being treated. Look at what our mayor gets for simply expressing herself every once in a while. That's unbelievable misogyny. So there's so much going on in the debate.
The first female mayor of
Amsterdam.
Of
the misogyny, and many politicians, female politicians.
She was accused of blood libel.
Yeah, I know.
Because by the Israeli ambassador to the Netherlands, because she talked about genocidal violence that was committed by Israel in Gaza.
We're sitting next to her. So
So it is.
No, but this is the problem is a lot bigger. The problem is a lot bigger, and you can look at anti-Semitism and the discussion on anti-Semitism and the Israeli-Gaza conflict as a Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a microcosm of what's going on in the public debate, which should be, and that is where your politics come in, because it's totally politicized. Everything is totally politicized, and that's the strength of your book.
But the answer is more education. As a teacher and scholar on Moroccan Jewish history, for example, I mean, we have politicians who declare that Muslims and Dutch Moroccans have anti-Semitism in their DNA. Well, this is Nazi rhetoric. Excuse me. What we do have in our DNA...
There are quite a few Jews who are opposed to that, by the way, thank
Sorry?
God. There are quite a few representatives of the Jewish community who are opposed to that.
Unfortunately, they did, yeah. But what Moroccans have in their DNA is Judaism, ironically. Because the saying in our scholarship on Moroccan Jewish history is, if you scratch an Arab, you'll find a Berber. If you scratch a Berber, you'll find a Jew. Yeah. So because Jewish populations are indigenous to Morocco, we have, well, I'm joking, but fundamentally it's true. But then we have now politicians again who say, well, these groups are the new anti-Semites. Even during the opening of the Holocaust, the National Holocaust Museum, where you're responsible of, the whole debate about that and the aftermath of the opening, which was, of course, already problematized by, we're not going to go into that, but the talk afterwards was not about
different evening. Yeah.
Let's talk about this history of the Holocaust in this country, because it's an important discussions to have, and how can Holocaust education be beneficial to all society, not ascribe to a certain group in society what happens now. But the discussion after the opening of the National Holocaust Museum, which opened in 2024, long overdue, right? We have problems with anti-Semitic Muslims and Moroccans, and the multicultural society has failed because they don't uphold the same principles as we have. And one of the pillars of Dutch identity, we talked about it earlier, is freedom of expression, gender equality, sexual equality, and the Holocaust, which we're now the anti-Semites, they are the new anti-Semites. I think this is not beneficial to the conversation that we really should be having in this country.
Can I ask Emil a question, following on from that?
You can. I consider it the first question from the audience.
Thank you. So what I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, the Holocaust Museum opened very recently in a world very different from 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And you must have thought very deeply about how changes in the world over this time would affect your conception or the conception of the museum and the function that the museum could play in the world. And could you say a little bit about, I mean, presumably it's not the same museum that would have opened 20 years ago, or is it?
No, of course it isn't.
And it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts about that.
Of course it isn't. First of all, we were asked we were offered 1 million euros 10 years ago by a private donor if we would do a museum of genocide. We decided not to do it. Why did we decide not to do it? Because we have ownership of the Jewish history as a Jewish culture quarter and not of other instances of historical genocide. That is number one. And the ownership question was, if you look at the way that Holocaust museums have been developed in the past, the first generation of Holocaust museums, let's say in the 1970s and 80s, were based on, I would say, totally a survivor-based narrative. The second generation of Holocaust museums entered societal discussions and contemporary societal discussions. One of the things that we have tried to do, because this is a national museum dealing with the way that the Jews, what happened to the Jews in the Netherlands, and not just another Holocaust museum that tells the entire story, is that we concentrated on of course, on the geopolitical European, the global European, Netherlands, Amsterdam situation, but we also tried to concentrate on the effect that it had on human beings. Mm-hmm. The answer that I would typically give to anyone asking what is the overall message of this new National Holocaust Museum is that this museum actually shows what happens if we stop seeing each other as human beings. And the concentration on the individual fate and on the individual person, on the individual people, and on what happened to them is I think the most important element in this museum. If you look at the reality of running a museum since 24, we have we are very happy with the visitor numbers. Right after the riots around Maccabi Tel Aviv, our visitor numbers dropped under 50%. And it took quite a while to recover. We had 125,000 visitors in the first year, which is exactly what we wanted and which we're very proud of, and the museum is very well received. But the online reactions to any time that we discover the word Holocaust are horrendous. I mean, there's not I gave you one example, the one that we won. It's the 5th architecture prize that we won with the new museum yesterday. It's a National Architecture Prize. We were congratulated. We put it online. And the first comment online was, how many shekels did you pay to get this prize? There's a lot of prejudice under this, and this is one person, and it's the mishugaz of the social media, I know that. But the extent to which the topic that we're dealing with is hyperpolarized, makes it very difficult for us to maneuver larger topics. One of our main goals initially, 5 years ago, we said we want this to be, a museum is more than a permanent exhibition. A museum is about programming, and our programming should also involve discussions on contemporary issues, should also discussions on historical genocides. That's what we're there for. It's become, if not practically, strategically impossible to do so at the moment. And that is what I call this hyperpolarization. So it's become very, very difficult, and it involves it involves every visitor. We've had, I mean, and we actually cater discussions, especially with school groups, and we train our staff, and they're very successful in training it. And the incidents is typically the teachers who will, if something is being said in a classroom or with a school group, it's actually the teachers that are in panic, and our museum docents that know how to deal with it. And so you open up a discussion, so it's very good that people come. And you should have an open discussion about that. But I would be lying if I would be saying that running such a museum now is easier than 5 years ago. Although there was COVID, it was not easy either. But
last question for you before I go to the other. Mark, you had a reason to ask that question, because what is the reason to what intrigued you?
What triggered you?
Yeah.
Well, because I think it's such an important question about what you read into the Holocaust and how that changes over time, and how different people read very different things into it. And as Emil knows better than me, there was a good deal of debate at the time of the first Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington about whether that was the appropriate way and how to do it, and the debate has gone on amongst very serious people ever since. And so of course it's very difficult now to run a museum like that in a world where the central topic of conversation for many people is around the Middle East. And it makes the life...
around the word genocide.
And around the word genocide. And so there's a dilemma. On the one hand, a museum like this has a more important function than ever, and on the other hand, its life is made more hellish than ever. So I wanted to hear how he was thinking about it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Let's call it, like yourself, let's call it interesting.
I'm looking into the audience. It's not an obligation to participate, but it's a possibility. So I see 2 hands. We might have more. I'm coming to you with the microphone, otherwise the people at home will not be able to understand you.
Thank you. Fascinating book, because it doesn't give only the view of anti-Semitism, Jews and the world, but also the groups around it. You mention, for instance, the miniserie Holocaust, aired in 1978, I think. In
74, I think. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
The Holocaust miniserie on ABC. You can say it was an answer on the miniserie Roots, what was 1 year earlier, and that's about the history of the blacks in the United States. But this series, Holocaust, wasn't the roots of the Jewish community, because they would have started in the Temple of Solomon. But the roots of the Jews is Auschwitz. How did the black community react on that? Because they had their roots showing they had suffered a lot as slaves. And then the Jews are coming saying, oh, we have suffered much more than you are.
So,
was a discussion.
So there was, of course, a very bitter and difficult discussion that went on in the US even before the airing of the Holocaust, because and I cite, I mean, I think James Baldwin is an important figure in this debate. He has this conversation with the Hollywood scriptwriter Bud Schulberg precisely about what the relationship should be in contemporary America between the memory of slavery versus the memory of the Holocaust. And so it becomes very acrimonious, because it has something of the quality of a kind of competition in suffering. And Baldwin and others feel that the specificity for the United States of the experience of slavery, the fact that slavery is in the DNA of the United States, is being lost, being jeopardized by this increasing attention that is being paid to the Holocaust and the central position that is given to the Holocaust Memorial Museum and so on. And that's a playing out of a larger tension that involves the breakup of an older civil rights alliance between black groups and Jewish groups. But I think what struck me as I went into this, that the two groups had been inextricably involved from the very beginning, for this reason, that when the Jewish immigrants arrive in the United States, they arrive into a land of emancipation. They arrive from Russia into the condition of emancipation, which is being denied or rolled back to the American black population at precisely the same time. And so both groups are in fact aware of this. They cannot but be aware of this. And for many liberal American Jews, it almost demands their participation in the civil rights movement. And so there's this sense of a kinship, almost a cousinship between the two, because both are deeply affected by the process of emancipation. And so it goes way back before the 1970s. It goes back to the 1910s, 1920s at the very earliest. And it deteriorates after the 1970s, I would say, for the next 20 or 30 years, if one had to generalize about it.
But you mentioned the Olympics of suffering, so to speak,
yeah.
who suffered more. The problem is that we seem to no longer allow, and we're way beyond the 1970s now, that we no longer allow the coexistence of related or unrelated histories of suffering.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And I think that is one of the big problems that we have. It can exist together very well. I mean, it should exist together very well, and it is actually our role in academia to defend that. But it would help if we would have a couple of politicians who would support us.
I will collect. Did you want to comment? Did I interrupt you? No.
Go ahead.
I will hold it for you, but there's another question.
Thank you. Professor Mazower, Emil explained very well what a bit of the reasons and the difficulties of the Holocaust Museum. Your university is at the epicenter of a lot of stuff happening in the United States at the moment. You didn't say a word about it yet. I'm very curious about Trump using anti-Semitism in a very derogatory way. And I wonder if you can say something about the situation at your university, which is really the epicenter of a huge attack on everything what and you also appreciate.
Well, absolutely. I won't talk in particular about what I think about how the university administration has handled its negotiations with the federal government for obvious reasons, and they're ongoing. But I think you can see a clear contrast between the way Columbia has approached the problem and the way Harvard has approached the problem. The situation has radically altered for all universities in the United States. At Columbia now, you can't enter the campus except by showing a pass and going through security, which is shocking to somebody like me who's been there for 20 years, where the 116th Street gates were always open. It's hard to say how shocking that simple fact is about what it tells you about the state of the university. I think one of the ways in which perhaps my book has been helped by political developments in the United States is that the argument that, amongst other things, this is an issue that could be weaponized by people who really didn't care one way or the other about anti-Semitism is rather easier to make these days. We have a real issue here, which is what people are doing now in politics when they're using the question of anti-Semitism. And a subsidiary issue that interests me a lot, that doesn't get a lot of play in the media, but people who are concerned about this as an issue on campus, you would think might be concerned to find out what works. That is to say, you might expect them to be interested in such research as it exists on what we know from history about when certain methods have been turned out to work and when others have not. There's very little interest.
Work towards what?
Work towards minimizing or eradicating anti-Semitism.
I'm sorry that nobody will hear you. So
the question was, can I say something about my own experience at the university? Yeah. Well, my experience in some ways is that I teach as usual with the students who I would have taught before, but the the change comes in two realms predominantly. One is that the students' lives have been utterly transformed, and so one's pastoral obligations as a professor are changed. because they are much more anxious about many things. They're not really anxious about what they can talk about with me, but they're in general anxious. And they're often, some of them, anxious about their status. And the same is true of some of my junior colleagues. I mean, the reason I think I worry so much about the state of education is that I have junior colleagues who would now not teach a course on the history of the Middle East. And actually, in my opinion, that's not a foolish decision on their part. Professionally, they're in an environment where they would have to watch every step and watch every word. And so you have to question how education can function in that kind of environment. It's very different from a few years ago.
Thank you. I collect, I think, 2 questions here. First yours, please, and then the gentleman over there.
Okay. I have 2 short questions. One's for the whole panel about the anti-Semitic experience, because generally what we see is that minorities seem to be always define what is discrimination, how they feel discrimination. But with Jews it doesn't work like that. Everybody else decides what is anti-Semitism except Jews. So our experience doesn't seem to count, and it's really everybody wants to have a clear definition. So I would like to hear something from the panel about that. And I have a short question also for Ms. Bourras, because you were talking about censor, and my experience from what I see, and my daughter is at university, surrounded by kefirs, and the feeling is that actually the opposite around. The censor is not about anti-Semitism. It's about that you can't say anything that doesn't comply with the new, I would call it fake progressive narrative, which is very anti-Israeli. So everybody that is even a little bit not in the narrative is being shut down. So I'm trying to understand how you come to a completely opposite feeling.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Sure. we go first to the...
Yeah, sure. I can comment on that.
There was a question for everybody else
Yeah.
as well, but you might start with the last one. Sure.
First of all, that the not taking seriously the lived experiences of Jews themselves who experience anti-Semitism.
It's not accepted. The definition is done by others and not by Jews.
Yeah, that is something that Emile already spoke about. So I'll leave it to you to answer that question.
Well, I think that what you're talking about, we touched upon it. I mean, the word I didn't use so far is and that is probably also an answer to part of your second question, is the concept of the delegitimization of any kind of attachment to Israel, to the people in Israel. I'm not talking about the government. To the people in Israel, or even to the government, is not forbidden. I mean, the freedom of expression actually involves allowing everybody to express an opinion, and then we can do that in academia. But I can see that I see the problem, and I experience the problem. It is the task of docents to keep that open. It's very difficult. It's not always easy. Not all docents are equally effective, and that's probably that gray area in between where you stand and where I stand. Is at what point does the experience of the individual student at what point does it become a problem? And
at
that's
what point does it become an anti-Semitic climate?
Yeah, well, but even the definition of anti-Semitism, I agree that but listen, half of the book is about, or let's say the last half of the book is about the IRA definition, and which we didn't discuss, but the IRA definition is very, very complicated. But the definitions that have actually been adopted are all definitions, including the Valer definition.
The International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition.
International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which is being adopted by the majority of governments and also by many cities in the Netherlands. And the later Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism as it was defined by the Valer Institute.
Let's not go entirely into
no,
that.
No, but they have a very strong Jewish involvement. That's what I'm going to say. Yeah. That's what I'm saying. So it's the current definitions that we have actually a very strong Jewish involvement. But I think really that you talk more about the experienced anti-Semitism and the way in which so the definition and the experience of anti-Semitism, that may be two very different things, and we discussed it, I think.
Yeah, I think there is a conflation between Jews and Israelis that happens continuously. And also, without going into your question more deeply, because I also see that it's already a conversation that happens within Jewish communities. And I'm saying communities because, I mean, obviously there is a diversity of opinions that exist within those communities. When I was talking about censorship at my university, which is Leiden University, I see that we had, especially in the beginning, a lot of difficulty organizing teachings and Sorry? I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. I also participated in many teachings.
Oh, I'm sorry. Otherwise, we cannot talk up and down because...
I mean, this is an academic environment where many opinions are welcomed and respectfully, myself and my colleagues, we try to take this very seriously. So it's an open discussion where, for example, I speak about, Moroccan Jewish history and the migration of almost the complete Moroccan Jewish community to Israel, which is also adds to the conversation. But what I'm against is what's happening at my university is where we have the safety department videotaping students and faculty. What are you doing with those videos? We have surveillance on students and faculty. Surveillance, security officers, but also security officers in plain clothing. And this surveillance is based on ethnic profiling. I find that very, very problematic. So, well, this is Leiden. This is in Leiden. So for me, that's unacceptable.
I believe you have two different experiences of university life, which is entirely possible, of course. But a question here, and a lady over there, and I think then we're at the last question, I'm afraid. So,
Sir, Professor Mazower, so I didn't read your book yet, so I hope to do that. This is a question for all of you. I don't know who wants to answer it, and I hope I can make myself clear. So, if we agree that a lot that is called anti-Semitism is not anti-Semitism, as we discussed in a way. If we agree that for a lot of people on the more right wing, also politicians in the United States, in the Netherlands, other countries are weaponizing anti-Semitism for their own political gain. We agree on that. If we also then agree maybe that critique on Israel is not anti-Semitism. And then if we tie it into this last part of the discussion, in the more political activist pro-Palestinian movements, what there can we call anti-Semitic? Because I think in a way, even though maybe not by intent, you can see that the outcome of how the conflation between Jews and Israelis takes place is in a way really dangerous and unsafe for Jews. So what part there is anti-Semitism and where is the responsibility of this pro-Palestinian movement to not create more anti-Semitic, incidents even.
Okay, sure. I think it's one of the critical questions, isn't it? Which comes back to there's another way of putting what I suggested earlier, which is where is the overlap between anti-Semitism and, let's call it loosely, anti-Zionism, accepting that both words are kind of amorphous in some way. I mean, my own view, it's just my own view, is that anti-Semitism, I'm not going to legislate for other people. So in my view, it would be preferable and safest, as far as possible, to confine the use of anti-Semitism to the designation of an ethnic prejudice. Right. And so criticism of Israel that is critical of Israel's actions on the count of the fact that they're carried out by Jews seems to me obviously anti-Semitic, or in another category, assuming that Jews support Israel, is also deeply problematic on similar kinds of lines. But there are other kinds of criticisms of Israel that do not seem to me to fall under that category, where in fact it may be a hypothesis that the criticism is motivated by anti-Semitism, but it may not be motivated by anti-Semitism. It may be motivated by a variety of other things, such as the fact that if you're American, you protest at your use of your tax dollars. I don't say you're right to protest, but that may be the motivation, or maybe a motivation about land. So there are other things that are inherently ambiguous, and there are other things that are unambiguous. And then the last point I want to make is there's a lot of offensive behavior on all sides that is not accurately described as ethnic prejudice, but, you know, for instance, I have Israeli students and friends who were treated very badly, purely on the grounds that they're Israeli. Now, by my definition, which I would stick to, that is not strictly speaking anti-Semitism, but it's making the same kind of assumption that people were making about Russians on campus in the spring of 2022, when I had Russian students who were being criticized on the grounds they were Russian and they must support Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And I don't think that's great either. And it may seem like a pedantic point to say that it's not anti-Semitism, because the people concerned felt very, suffered because of it, and I sympathized with that. But that's how I would approach the problem.
But at the same time, and I'm responding more to you, but picking up on the question that was asked, if we see there is we agree on this, there is an increase in anti-Semitic incidents. There's also an increase in anti-Semitic incidents which are being justified, let's say, within the discourse about Israel and Palestine. I'm trying to phrase it as clearly as I can. And where does and you were responding to that already, where does the beginning of the movement as such, which is not a movement, I mean, but it's a big movement at the same time. Where is is there a point at which there is also a responsibility? Mm-hmm. And I think, and that's the point that I made with the students' protests as well. I mean, I think it's, as much as I appreciate your position, which is actually very important, because it takes away a lot of the pressure of using the term anti-Semitism, and it keeps the term anti-Semitism as clear as possible. I also appreciate the fact that the way that we have our debate at the moment is actually so poisonous that it has led to a delegitimization. I used the word before, but I would like you to respond to the word delegitimization of any kind of connection to the State of Israel. Mm-hmm. And that is very threatening for, let's say, my nephew who has to go into a shelter tonight or tomorrow. So I cannot. So I'm feeling connected to anything related to the State of Israel has actually become dangerous. It has become dangerous in the way that I communicate with people, but it also has become dangerous literally. I mean, because you can also be attacked. I think that was the point that Yair was making, and I would like to hear a response to it, because the two positions don't exclude each other.
No, I mean, if I was to take a strict position on this, I would say, as I said before, that first of all, any kind of dangerous or threatening behavior is dangerous or threatening behavior. Okay. Secondly, to target somebody because they're Israeli is wrong. But in my mind, it's useful to make a distinction between that and the question of anti-Semitism. Now, that's not how it's going to strike your nephew. I understand that. I grant that. And that's where we get into this grey, ambiguous zone. And then there will no doubt be some cases where it's just impossible to say. It's just really difficult to disentangle one thing from the other. Why is all of this important? Why does it matter? Well, the reason that it matters is what you're also talking about is where is the space for political debate? And that's wherever you draw the line. If you don't draw the line, you're rendering political debate impossible. And so obviously we're going to draw the line in different places, but the fundamental principle is you need to have the capacity to have political debate about the behavior of states. There's no particular reason to exempt Israel from that general rule. Nobody in this room, I think, is probably suggesting that you should.
We discussed
so
that.
then, right? So then you need to decide where is it. And it actually is in exactly this kind of this example against this example against this example that one starts to flesh out. Well, yes, that sounds plausible. No, that doesn't sound plausible. And maybe that's the process that we need to go through.
Nadia Bourras, we're trying to close up.
Well, I don't want to open the box of
No, but I
Pandora.
saw you responding to your ears. And you said you were nodding and you wanted to come in, I thought. But
yeah, because I think to make it more explicit, for example, the slogan "From the river to the sea" is that considered anti-Semitic? I know that, we're not talking about definitions, but usages. And the usage of that slogan has multiple meanings as well. So in my book, it's not anti-Semitic, but I can fully understand that people find it, Jews find it very, not only offensive, but also speaks to a sense of unsafety and unsecurity. So I get that. But again, just following what the professor said, I think overall what we're trying to say in this very tense and sensitive public arena where we discuss this kind of topic, I think what is important, and hopefully I made myself clear, I'm not a very militant member of that community, because I think it's very important that we see the humanity in each other. So why would I upset you? But at the same time, I don't think we should center this whole discussion, because when we discuss atrocities, when we discuss what is really happening, and we should actually be talking about how can we stop this massacre that is happening in Gaza. And I'm not saying that this deflects from that, because it's equally important, but I think that it's not about feelings. At the end, it's about international law and the shared values that we have. And if we let that go, we're doomed.
Neither of us disagreed. Yeah.
there is a gentleman over there who was the first, I understood, and there's a woman over here, a lady over here.
Thank you. Yeah, I would like to ask a question about words again, because that's how we started. Because what I've always wondered about is there's anti-Semitism, and there's also the word racism, and somehow the two don't always seem to be connected. And what has puzzled me also in the protests that we have in the universities is that a lot of the people taking part in these protests are super sensitive about racism. And then when it comes to prejudice against Jewish people and just easily conflating them with positions about Israel, I don't see that same sensitivity. And I was wondering, is that connected with the fact that there are two separate words, anti-Semitism and racism?
Okay, that's a very interesting question, and it's a long and complicated history behind it. And to a large extent, the interwar history of the word racism was very closely connected with the conceptualization of anti-Semitism, and of course anti-Semitism was regarded as an instance of racism and continued to be so, and for many people continues to be so. And then that's in its origin, I think, a European story. That is to say, the thinkers and the authors who are most important to read if you want to figure this stuff out are writing in the context of the rise of the Third Reich. But then there's this other story that emerges that's essentially a North American story, where race discourse is rather different, and where once the Black Jewish coalition has sort of disintegrated, and when you have the emergence, and this is also part of the story, of a anti-discriminatory monitoring bureaucracy in the federal government that is put in place after the civil rights legislation precisely to use racial categories to monitor the extent to which American society is becoming less racist. At that point, that bureaucracy exists to protect certain categories who were supposed to be assisted by civil rights legislation. Initially, predominantly, but not exclusively, the African American community and others. Jews are not part of that. In fact, most ethnic European origin groups are not part of that monitoring bureaucracy. They're not regarded as protected groups under the legislation. And that's the origin, I think, of where you end up in the early 21st century with the accusation that the American left in its origins is not willing to take Jewish complaints of persecution seriously because they have been shaped by this experience and by the desire to intensify the bureaucracy. And Jews are not seen as part, and in fact are not part of that. And then when anti-Semitism does emerge, the Jewish reaction, understandably, is, well, what about, isn't this important too? And so you're in the middle of a kind of argument about power and protected groups that then we've inherited in this situation.
But wouldn't you agree that the obsession of the what is often called the intersectionality movement, the idea that all kinds of oppression are sort of interconnected, that the obsession of the intersectionality movement with whiteness and with oppressors also defines a part of that issue? I mean, because the Jews are no longer white.
Well, the way of thinking about this goes back to way before intersectionality, because if you have a critique that sees Zionism as a colonial project and as an anachronism in the age of decolonization, and then furthermore sees not only Zionism as a colonial project, but as racist itself, then you've created an enormous obstacle to accepting that Jews could be it's not impossible to understand that Jews could be the victims of racism. Of course, all of these things are logically consistent, but you're locking yourself gradually into, as I say, words that tend to be weaponized in this very ahistorical kind of way. And I think there's a lot to be said, probably more than we have time to now, about the transformations of the notion of race in particular, and the transplantation of a notion of race out of an American context into a Middle Eastern context. Not that it's irrelevant, it's not irrelevant, but the context is so different, and so much of the commentary doesn't recognize the differences that you end up with further confusions.
There's a gentleman over here who has the last question. I will hold it for you.
You talked about the politicization of the word anti-Semitic, but those protests, those Gaza protests, when I see from President Trump, okay, he's using it as a politicized word, but if we truly see into what's happening, I saw a sign of "Kill all the Jews," and they're shouting from the river to the sea. Is it so that they are standing up for the Palestinians? A lot will say, yes, we do. But are they for the Palestinians or are they against the Jews? And if there's a group against the Jews, isn't that the agenda? Because it's always also, okay, we're supporting the Jews, but there are a lot of, we're supporting the Palestinians, but there are a lot of other groups that are also suppressed, like the Kurds or the Uyghurs. You never hear of them in support. It's always the Jews. So maybe there is an anti-Semitic agenda behind it. What's your idea about that?
So I suppose there are two questions there. One question is, are some of these slogans, like "from the river to the sea," inherently genocidal? And the other question is, why do people keep going on about the Palestinians when there are lots of other cases? I come back to the fundamental point that I'm making. People are imposing clarity on ambiguous situations. If you're a 17-year-old in a protest, the protest is part of your political education. You go up and you chant a slogan. Now, if you go up and chant a slogan that you know and intend to be genocidal, that's one thing. But if you're chanting a slogan, the odds are you're not actually sure what that slogan means. And I've spoken to people in protest, and they've come back, and they're young people, and I said to them, what were you shouting? They say, we were shouting Free Palestine. And so that's interesting. What did you mean? Did you mean back to the 67 borders? Did you mean the 48 borders? You know? And so that's a good question. I'm not sure. I need to read some more about it. That seemed to me absolutely the appropriate answer, right? Their heart was moved by this. They felt the moral impulse. And they were going to educate themselves. They didn't mean anything, they certainly did not mean anything genocidal by it. We could have more of a conversation about River to the Sea. I think frankly, for me, there's a lot, to be blunt about, there's a lot of silliness talked about that particular slogan that everybody uses on both sides, and different people use it to mean totally different things. So that's the ambiguity question. Why do people worry about the Palestinians? Let's call this the double standards argument. Why are you going on about Israel? The double standards argument got going in the context of the Human Rights Council at United Nations in the 80s and 90s, which had large numbers of its members who were egregious dictators violating the human rights of huge numbers of people, but they kept insisting that the only case to talk about, the main case to talk about, was Israel. And people felt, I think understandably, well, that's ridiculous, right? Now, that wasn't necessarily anti-Semitism. That could have been other things. It could have been politics. But it was obviously a case of double standards. I myself make a distinction between organizations and individuals. I'm not in the business of policing what issues an individual chooses to mobilize around, because people have all sorts of reasons to mobilize around particular issues. And if you want to mobilize in defense of the bears of northern Greece, I think that's fine. Why should you mobilize about Palestine? Okay. One reason might be the reason that you suspect, that people are obsessed about Jews and they want to take this out in that particular way. But there was a very interesting political scientist who I think had no particular axe to grind, and he interviewed a lot of people, and he wrote a rather interesting article about what are the reasons why people want to agitate on that particular question. He said that's one category, but that's not the only category. He says another category is that's what they read about in the papers, and they don't know anything else, and so they involve themselves in that. But that's not anti-Semitism, that's ignorance. They said a third category is what you might call third worldism, that they feel an instinctive sympathy with what they regard as an underdog in a post-colonial context or colonial context. And they feel that it's their historical responsibility at that moment to agitate for that. And he said another people might, as it were, be moved to support that because there's a sense in which they say, not in my name. Right. There's either some ethnic or familial origin to this, or they might be American students and they are feeling it not in my name for that reason. And so you can't assume that you know. And I think it's a false assumption to assume that the reason the Palestinian cause has become as popular as it has amongst students in the United States is because of anti-Semitism. I see no evidence for that. There may be anti-Semitism in some quarters of it, but that's far too simple an explanation for what's going on.
Emil, you have the right to the last word, and then I'm closing off.
Well, one of the things, because I want to go back to the book, which you should all buy. I mean, I'm shameless about that. One thing that I realized when reading the book is something that has been bothering me for a long time already in this discussion. That is the use of the definite article. Mm-hmm. I was listening to your question, you said, isn't the agenda... Mm-hmm. No, there's a variety of agendas. Isn't the genocide? No, there's different interpretations of so the constant use of the definite article blocks discussion. Yeah. If your book shows anything, it shows that. Yes. It shows that. Yes. And that was my last...
It's a book about the word A.
Yeah, exactly.
It's also a book about the history of a word, and I thank you very much, all three of you, for coming along and sharing your thoughts with this unrehearsed evening. I didn't put any of the questions to you which we are going to discuss, but you were still willing to come and to discuss this sort of topic, which is toxic and dangerous in many ways. It can hurt your feelings, but it also can hurt your reputation and can hurt your career. So thank you very much for doing this. I think it's very important. We kept it academically, but we ventured into our time, which is of course what we wanted to do as well. And that's for a great part because of your questions. Thank you very much for coming along and for, excuse me for keeping you here a little bit over time. I hope you won't hold it against me, and I will hope to see you back. Yeah. Thank you very much.